Hello, and welcome to chapters 1 and 2 of the Assassination Simulation. My name is Tess, I'm the author, and I'm so excited you're here. A couple things before we begin. First, this is a work in progress, so if you have any comments or critiques, I would love to hear them. Also, I am not a professional narrator, so I'm going to do my best. Finally, these chapters do contain descriptions of violence and assault, so please take that into account before listening. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 1. Evelyn stood on the sidewalk, looking down at the dead man. At the man she had killed. The rain fell around them, soaking her hair, causing his blood to drip from her face. She knew she should feel something. Panic, remorse, anything. But the only emotion that penetrated through the fog of her mind was confusion. She couldn't understand what had happened, how she had ended up killing another human being. It felt like an eternity passed before flashing lights, and the sound of slamming doors and shouting voices surrounded her. She barely noticed. Someone grabbed her, ripping her umbrella from her shaking hand. The city lights reflected off the damp fabric, the area around the umbrella's tip glistening red. Someone spoke next to her, but their words didn't reach her, and she winced as her arms were pulled behind her back. The handcuffs were cold against her bare, wet wrists. As they guided her away, she shut her eyes, taking solace in the darkness. The police station was cold. Evelyn couldn't stop shivering, despite the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. They had given her scrubs to change into, and some privacy to wipe the blood off her face and neck. Someone had given her a cup of tea, but she hadn't touched it. Then they had escorted her to a small, square room where she now sat, waiting. The sound of a door opening made her look up. An officer entered the room. He stepped forward, pulled out the chair on the opposite side of the table, and sat, placing a tablet, a notepad, and a small folio in front of him. "Please state your name for the record," he said, looking up at her. His voice was soft, with a slight Mandarin accent. They had her ID. They knew who she was. Taking a deep, calming breath, she sat up straighter in the chair. Evelyn Williams. The officer pulled a pen from his breast pocket and scribbled a note. "Miss Williams, my name is Officer Tan. How long have you lived in Singapore?" 2 years, she replied. "What brought you here?" "I was hired as a translator at the Marina Bay Sands." Officer Tan's pen paused, and he looked at her with marginally more interest. The Marina Bay Sands was one of the most famous hotels in Singapore City. When Evelyn had gotten the offer letter 2 years ago, it had almost kindled a spark of excitement in her. Almost. "All right, Miss Williams," Officer Tan continued. "Walk me through what happened tonight." Evelyn closed her eyes, collecting her thoughts. "I was on my way home from work. That man, the man, he was on the train. I had seen him before. I caught him staring at me a few times. I think he was drunk. I was polite, but didn't encourage him." "Seems a little late to be getting off work," Officer Tan cut in. "You must have caught one of the last trains. Is that normal?" "It depends. I stay as long as they need me to. Some clients work late." She thought back to the meeting that evening, followed by dinner and drinks. The high-profile client had been happy to sit, sipping his wine and talking business late into the evening. He was French, which was why she had volunteered to stay. They had hired her for her fluency in Japanese, which was the language she normally worked in. French, however, would always be her first love, and she didn't want to lose it, even though speaking it was still painful. "Did you notice the man getting off at your station?" Officer Tan asked, interrupting Evelyn's wandering thoughts. "No," she responded. "I didn't notice he was following me until I was back at my apartment." "All right. And what happened then?" "He snuck up on me, tried to get me to go with him. When I said no, he got angry and tried to grab me. I defended myself. I didn't mean to. Didn't mean for what happened to happen. I was just so scared. That was a lie. She hadn't been scared, not by the end. She had been mad. There was so much pent-up anger inside of her. She hadn't meant to kill him, but she had wanted to hurt him. Officer Tan didn't respond, scribbling a few more notes. He finally stopped and looked directly at her. Miss Williams, let's talk about your umbrella. Evelyn glanced up at him for the first time, meeting his hard, almond eyes. She had been holding on to a faint hope they wouldn't notice. I have to give you credit, ma'am. This was a first. In 14 years on the force, I have never seen anyone killed with an umbrella before. We couldn't figure out how you managed it at first, until we inspected the umbrella in question. It's clearly designed to be a weapon. It's not technically illegal to own, but in Singapore, using it is against the law, even in self-defense. He stared at her, gauging her reaction. She looked away, back down at the table, choosing to remain silent. Evelyn had suspected her umbrella might not be legal when she purchased it. Singapore City was considered safe, but it was still a city. She knew that firearms and other weapons of self-defense were illegal, but had convinced herself that an umbrella would go unnoticed. It was a tactical umbrella, made with a thick steel shaft, a sharp carbide-tipped ferrule, and cut-resistant fabric. It also had a small speaker built into the hook-shaped handle which, at the push of a button, would blare an impressively loud police siren. The moment the umbrella arrived in the mail, she had tested the fabric with a kitchen knife and executed a few of her favorite kendo forms. Kendo, a Japanese form of fencing, had been a passion of hers since middle school. It had been many years since she had competed, but she hadn't let herself get rusty. Miss Williams, are you aware that your neighbor, Miss Lee, has a doorbell camera installed? Officer Tan asked after a pause. Evelyn could feel his cold eyes glaring down at her. Her heart sank. She hadn't known that. He continued, I'm going to review the footage with you. There are some discrepancies between what it shows and your statement. You're going to need to explain them. Evelyn hesitated, then nodded, knowing what the video would show. Officer Tan picked up the tablet, turned it on, and propped it up on the table where they could both watch the screen. The frozen picture it displayed was grainy, but easy to distinguish. There she was, halfway up the stairway leading to her second-floor apartment. It was a narrow, outdoor stairwell covered by an awning, and she was frozen in the process of shaking water off her umbrella. The officer hit play. On the screen, Evelyn made her way up the final few stairs. As she got closer to the camera, her features became visible despite the poor quality. They were forgettable. Average height, average build, with frizzy, shoulder-length brown hair and uninteresting hazel eyes. Evelyn had always joked that she had donated her attractiveness genes to her twin sister Mildred. She was happy to be unremarkable, in exchange for her sister's breathtaking beauty. Mildred had been a very successful model, a career that had surprised no one. Evelyn closed her eyes, forcing her mind away from her sister. As always, thoughts of Mildred brought all her old emotions to the surface. She felt them trying to force their way up inside of her, a swirling torrent of guilt, anger, and grief that threatened to consume her. She took a deep, steadying breath and pushed the torrent back down. Over the last 3 years, she had mastered this skill. She'd learned to keep her feelings locked deep inside, never letting them take control. Until tonight. After a moment, she opened her eyes, looking back at the screen. She was at her apartment door, fiddling with her key. The man had appeared behind her and was already halfway up the stairs. The video had no audio, but Evelyn's mind filled in the silence. Hey there, sexy. The voice came from uncomfortably close behind her. It was loud, a little slurred. Evelyn jumped, dropping her keys, and spun around. Behind her, only a few feet away, was the man. His hand rested on the railing, and his outline swayed slightly against the stairwell lights. "I've been watching you on the train. Come with me, I'll show you a good time." He walked towards her, slow but steady, up the last remaining stairs. Every muscle in Evelyn's body tensed. She took a step back, bumping into her apartment door. Her keys had fallen down the first 2 steps, and the man now stood over them. Fear spiked inside of her, trying to push through to the surface. Evelyn forced it down. "It's late, and I'm not interested. Please leave." She made her voice firm. "Come on!" His voice was louder, his inebriation more obvious than it had been before. "I've seen how you've been looking at me. Don't play games, little girl." He took another step forward, 1 foot on the edge of the small walkway in front of her door. "You need to back up." Anger replaced her fear. It boiled inside of her, beating against her internal walls. Is this what had happened to Mildred? Had she been alone, caught off guard, unable to defend herself? "Come on, stop playing hard to get," he slurred, and reached for her. Years of training took over. She slipped into a defensive stance, brought her umbrella up, and slammed it hard into the man's wrist, knocking it aside with an audible crack. For a moment, he stood there frozen with shock, staring down at his wrist. Then his eyes snapped back up to hers, looking significantly more sober than they had a second ago. "You cunt!" he screamed. "You broke my fucking wrist!" He stepped towards her, the motion angry and aggressive. The dam inside of Evelyn broke. Anger that she had kept caged for years exploded through her, and she directed every ounce at the man. She swung again, hitting him violently on the side of his head. Blood gushed down his temple, his skin split open. She screamed, striking him again and again, driving him back. He stumbled, feet slipping on the stairs as he raised his hands, trying to protect himself. Her rage boiled beyond the point of control. She, unlike her sister, was not defenseless. She moved to finish him with a match-ending thrust to the chest, putting all her weight, terror, and years of pent-up anguish into the blow. In a kendo match, using the blunted bamboo blades, this kind of move usually struck the opponent's padded chest. It hurt and left bruises. The man was a step below her, hunched over and turned slightly to the side, with his arms around his head. The sharpened tip of her umbrella hit him right above his collarbone. The 2-inch-long ferrule slid easily into the side of his neck. She yanked it back, and blood spurted everywhere. It soaked the front of her shirt, hitting her in the face. It was in her mouth, though she barely registered the coppery taste, or the feel of it dripping, warm and sticky, down her cheek. She watched him fall, slowly backwards. There was a thud and some clatter as he slid and rolled to the bottom of the staircase. Evelyn watched herself on the screen, slowly descending the stairs. She carefully avoided stepping in the wet, red trail she was following. The man lay there on the sidewalk. She remembered the sound of his gasping breath, gurgling through his ruined throat. A dark pool spread around his head. He looked frightened, had begged with his eyes for her help. She hadn't. The video played for a few more seconds, distantly showing her looking down at the man, doing nothing. Officer Tan leaned forward and turned off the screen. They sat in total silence. Evelyn stared at the table, refusing to meet the officer's eyes. "Miss Williams," he continued, after it was clear that she would not be the one to break the silence. "It's obvious that the man was harassing you, but your reaction was extreme. You could have run once it was clear you had the upper hand. Why didn't you?" Evelyn said nothing. "Your umbrella has a built-in alarm. Why didn't you use it to scare him off?" Officer Tan asked, his voice growing louder. Evelyn said nothing. Officer Tan glanced at her for another moment before he opened the small folio and pushed it forward in front of Evelyn. 2 pages sat displayed in front of her, hastily printed on white, loose-leaf paper. The first was a screenshot of a newspaper article listing the results from the 2017 Shoryu High Intercollegiate Kendo Tournament. The Shoryu High was the largest kendo competition in the United States. Someone had highlighted Evelyn's name. She had placed 5th in the country that year, her senior year of college. Mildred had been so excited for her. She always flew in to watch Evelyn compete. By then, Mildred had been at the height of her modeling career, with a packed schedule of fashion shows and photo shoots all over the world. She was frequently busy through the summer months and holidays, but every year she would clear her schedule for the weekend of the Shoryu High. It became a tradition, even after Evelyn had graduated and could no longer compete. They would go months without talking, both becoming absorbed in their individual lives, but every March they would come together to watch the competition, and it would be like no time had passed. The second page was also a screenshot of a newspaper article. The date at the top read July 7th, 2019. Evelyn stared down at the picture of her sister. The photo was one of her most famous magazine covers. Next to it read the headline, "Supermodel Mildred Williams, missing, presumed dead, in human trafficking incident." Evelyn shut her eyes, taking quick, deep breaths, fighting to keep herself from becoming overwhelmed. "You're an impressive athlete, Miss Williams," Officer Tan continued, his voice hard. "You knew when that man was no longer a threat, when you could have run." Evelyn said nothing, squeezing her eyes together. "I understand why tonight's events would be particularly triggering for you," he continued, laying a hand on Mildred's photo. "This had to have been hard. You were twins. I read that you were close. Did you get help after this happened? Professionally, I mean." Evelyn said nothing, her hands clenched into shaking fists. They had forced her to see a therapist a few months after it was clear that Mildred wasn't coming back. She hadn't wanted to go, and had stopped as soon as she was allowed to. She never filled the prescriptions. The 2022 Shoryu High was next weekend. It was the first since the pandemic. Evelyn had pulled up the Facebook page on the train, curious to see who was competing. She had thought, maybe, that 3 years had been long enough, that she could finally revisit the Shoryu High without being overwhelmed by thoughts of Mildred. She had been wrong. Officer Tan stared at her for another full minute, waiting to see if she would say anything. Finally, he snapped the folio shut, shaking his head, and stood. "We can give you a few more minutes to pull yourself together, Miss Williams, but we're going to have this conversation." Evelyn didn't move or look up. The sound of the door shutting marked Officer Tan's exit. She should have asked for a lawyer. Singapore was infamous for its strict judicial system, and she knew she was in real trouble. She couldn't bring herself to care. It took a long time before Evelyn regained control of herself. She opened her eyes and suddenly noticed how silent everything had become. Until a few moments ago, sounds of conversation and other office noises had been audible through the wall, but they were gone now. The silence was eerie, unnatural. The lights above her flickered, causing her to look up right as the green indicator on the camera in the corner blinked once and went out. Then she heard footsteps, soft at first, rapidly approaching, the click-click of a pair of stilettos on a hard floor. They grew louder, stopping right outside, and the door opened. The thing that entered wasn't human. Chapter 2. The thing that stepped through the door was trying hard to look like a woman. It wore a sharp, well-fitting pantsuit, red pumps, and a pair of fashionable sunglasses. The effect was ridiculous, like an expensive caricature of a businesswoman. Everything else about it was wrong. It stood well over 6 feet tall and was much too thin, with long, unnaturally angled limbs. Its face was flat, its nose barely protruding enough to hold the sunglasses in place above prominent, slitted nostrils. Blonde curly hair covered its head, but it sat just slightly askew, clearly a wig. As the creature walked under the room's fluorescent light, the skin that Evelyn could see glittered an almost pearlescent white, and she could make out tiny, delicate scales. For a moment, Evelyn and the creature stared at each other. Evelyn couldn't move. This was too much. It felt like she had lost the ability to process what was happening. The thing raised its hands in a slow, non-threatening motion. They were covered in beautiful white leather gloves which fit perfectly over its 4 long fingers. It reached up and pulled off the sunglasses, revealing a pair of large, golden eyes with narrow pupils. As Evelyn watched, it blinked, little membranes sliding from both sides of its eyes to meet in the middle before snapping back out of sight. Evelyn finally reacted. She pushed backwards from the table, her cheap plastic chair tipped over, dumping her onto the floor. The blanket she was wrapped in tangled around her, preventing her from breaking or fall, and she yelled in fear and pain as she hit the floor. Struggling free, she stood and backed away as far as she could into the corner, looking around frantically for an exit. She was trapped. The room had only one door. The creature hadn't responded to her panicked movements. It stood there, calmly, hands still out in an unthreatening gesture. It looked her dead in the eyes, slowly pushed its right arm forward, and folded 2 of its fingers up in a good approximation of a peace sign. Evelyn stared, bewildered at the familiar gesture. Moving slowly, it reached down, pulled the chair that had previously held Officer Tan out, and sat. It placed a briefcase on the table, opened it, and pulled out a small, donut-shaped device. It set the device between them, then spoke. The words that came out of its mouth sounded strange, melodic, unlike any language Evelyn had ever heard. As soon as the thing stopped speaking, the donut device spoke in a disembodied, robotic English voice. "Please, do not be afraid. I am not here to hurt you. Please, sit down." The thing gestured at the overturned chair. There was no way this was actually happening, so Evelyn slowly peeled herself away from the wall. She picked the chair up from the floor and sat, scooting as far away from the table as she could in the small, cramped space. The creature's face split into an unsettlingly wide grin, its mouth full of small, sharp teeth. It reminded Evelyn of the Cheshire Cat, not quite threatening, but definitely not comforting. The creature spoke again, and the donut translated. "Hello, Evelyn. It's nice to meet you. My name is Azur. I am a representative sent by the Skenaros from the Understanding, and I am here to offer you a job." Evelyn was not sure what she had been expecting, but it definitely hadn't been that. The creature's absurd costume suddenly made more sense. She opened her mouth, and laughter burst out of her. The laugh sounded crazy. It stopped as quickly as it had started, replaced by quick, frantic breathing that she had to fight from turning into a full-on panic attack. The day had finally caught up with her. Minutes passed as she slowly took control of herself. Finally, when she was calm enough to respond. "A job?" The thing, Azur, nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, a job. It is okay to be confused. You are actually handling this quite well. You have not passed out or thrown anything. The last candidate I interviewed projectile vomited all over me." Azur hesitated, eyeing Evelyn up and down. "You are not going to vomit, are you? Do you think you could let me know if you think you are going to vomit?" Evelyn stared across the table, incredulous. It looked genuinely concerned, inching back in its chair. It was almost funny. "I'm not going to vomit," she said slowly. "What kind of a job offer?" "Evelyn, we have identified you as a candidate for participation in the Assassination Simulation. You have taken the life of a fellow human, making you and your weapon eligible. After review, We have selected you, which is why I am here. Personally, I think you may be one of the strongest candidates I have ever seen. An umbrella. Who kills someone with an umbrella? It's brilliant." Azur ended the statement with a grin and a soft chuckle. Even before the sound hit the translator, Evelyn could tell it was a laugh. She realized a lot of the creature's body language had been easy for her to understand. She wondered if it was intentional, another way to put her off guard. Regardless, Azur's amusement made her uneasy. Evelyn had killed someone. It didn't matter that she had done so with an umbrella. It wasn't funny. Azur continued. "I am going to give you a simplified explanation for now. My people, the Skenaros, are part of an alliance called the Understanding. In exchange for access to certain technologies, we agree not to commit violence against each other or any of the other species that make up the Understanding. Some species adjust to this better than others. Tension and conflict are inevitable, especially between parties with different backgrounds and perspectives. As more species joined, this became a problem. As a solution, a few hundred years ago, someone proposed what would become the Assassination Simulation. The Assassination Simulation is a competition. Think of it like football, except instead of competing in spandex over a ball, we compete to assassinate each other's politicians. The assassinations are real, but not permanent, and it gives everyone an outlet that keeps tensions down. We cannot compete ourselves, not without violating the nonviolence agreement. So instead, we select candidates from species outside of the Understanding. They receive the offer that you are receiving now, to become an assassin, in your case, representing the Skenaros." The translator stopped, but Evelyn's brain kept spinning. "You're offering me a job in which I'm supposed to kill alien politicians. For entertainment." "Yes." Evelyn blinked at the creature's forthrightness. "You make it sound like I have a choice, like I can choose to accept the offer or not." Azur nodded. "Of course you have a choice. We will not force you to do anything. If you're not interested, I will leave. No one will believe this conversation took place, and you will be in the same position that you were before. Sitting in police custody, about to be charged with manslaughter." The alien paused and looked directly into Evelyn's eyes, grinning. "Honestly, with that recording, they will probably up it from manslaughter to third-degree murder." Evelyn felt her heart sink. Azur was right. There was no chance of her getting out of this. She had heard of a man a few years ago who served 3 months for carrying a butter knife around Singapore. He didn't even use it, just admitted it was for self-defense. She would be in prison a long time, and even if they did eventually let her out, her current employer would never rehire her. She would need to start over somewhere else. Her reputation was ruined. "And if I accept?" Evelyn asked hesitantly. "If you accept, you will come with us and disappear. No one will remember your involvement this evening. We will delete or alter any records, including your neighbor's video. Your friends and family will look for you, but eventually they will give up and move on. You will work for us as a Skenarian assassin until the completion of the current season of the simulation. How long that is depends on you and your fellow assassins. The training takes around 9 months, the time it will take us to travel to the planet we will station you on. The simulation will last until one team wins. After that, assuming you survive, you go home." "Assuming I survive," Evelyn responded warily. "I thought you said that deaths aren't permanent." "Oh, they aren't. For your targets," Azur responded. "You, however, are not a member of the Understanding, and therefore will not receive access to the tech that revives them. Your targets aren't going to roll over and let you kill them. The work can be dangerous, and if you die, you stay dead." The woman shrugged, grinning her large, unsettling grin again. "There have to be some stakes. Otherwise, it would be boring to watch." Evelyn let that sink in for a moment. You're calling this a job, which means I get something in return. What do I get if I agree to risk my life and do this for you? If you survive, we will return you to Earth in any location of your choosing. We will give you a sizable amount of money, enough for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life. You will be able to retrieve your old identity or create a new one. Additionally, at the end of the simulation, the assassins who score in the top 25% will be granted a boon. A boon? Evelyn asked, not understanding. Oh, it can be anything, really, within reason, Azur replied. Humans usually ask for fame to go along with their fortune. They ask us to make them a famous singer, painter, actor, that kind of thing. Some ask for their youth back. We won't make you a child again, but we can set your biological age back to around 20 human years old. Except for a few things, the big one being immortality, you can ask for pretty much anything. Evelyn stared at Azur. She felt her heart start to beat faster, causing blood to pound in her ears. Can you track someone down? She asked breathlessly. Someone who is missing. Probably dead. Could you find them? Maybe even bring her back. Azur thought about it. Yes, she said, drawing the word out thoughtfully. There's no guarantee we could bring them back, though. We could definitely find them, and if they are deceased, so long as we find enough biological material, we can bring them back. However, if they have been cremated or otherwise destroyed, there isn't much we can do. But you could, at the very least, find out what happened, Evelyn replied frantically, full of hope for the first time in years. Yes, though if I'm honest, it sounds like a waste of a boon. You don't get another one, if that's all we can do. I'll do it, Evelyn said, jumping to her feet, knocking her chair over for a second time. Azur remained seated, her big yellow eyes boring into Evelyn, curious. Finally, the alien shrugged. All right, if you're ready, please take this. Azur reached for a second time into her briefcase and pulled out a small vial containing a single white capsule. Orally, please. It's not a suppository. Apparently, there is a human association between aliens and suppositories. Frankly, it's weird. This will knock you unconscious while we return you to our ship. Evelyn reached forward, taking the capsule. She looked up one more time at Azur, watching as she opened her briefcase and put the small translator back inside. Maybe this wasn't actually happening. Maybe this creature was lying. It didn't matter. Evelyn righted the chair again and sat back down. She opened the vial and popped the capsule into her mouth, swallowing. Darkness surrounded her almost immediately.